All right, everybody, let's settle down. I'm going to ask the panelists for the second panel to seat themselves. So that would be you, Gabriel. That would be you, Arnaud. That would be you, Chris. And that would be you, Shez. How do you pronounce this? Yeah, okay, good.
That's a good question.
So one uncharitable way of characterizing this morning was that we heard a lot of dissing of AI, which was, of course, my plan, because the one thing I don't like is triumphalism that comes before the reality testing. But we are fortunate to have some leaders, and I have to say brave leaders, because you have to actually be brave to start doing things that are not the way things are done. It's one thing to be Matt-mite and to single-handedly wrestle things into shape. It's another thing to be involved or even lead a company where you're trying to actually change the behavior of, with regard to data and with regard to AI, of not people just in your company, but more broadly in the healthcare system, which is not that well equipped to do so. And so we're lucky to have a group that can speak knowledgeably with regard to that challenge. And I just realized, again, that I don't know which order. Have you guys decided on an order?
You're up.
I think I'm first.
You're first.
Suggested.
All right. So our first speaker, and in the style of the previous panel, I will not make any introductions. First speaker, when he's not hacking out people's guts at Beth Israel Hospital, does interesting things with artificial intelligence. And so glad to hear from Gabriel on this topic, which I started a little bit pointedly asking, is there value in prediction? So Gabriel, come.
Okay. So I don't like standing behind podiums. They sometimes make me a little bit uncomfortable, so I'm going to stand over here. Can everybody hear me? I've spoken here multiple times, and everybody can hear you if you stand here. So my name is Gabriel Brad. I'm a trauma surgeon at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. I'm also head the surgical informatics lab there. I work as an instructor at DBMI, and I teach a class in health IT innovation. I'm also the co-founder of a company called Tissue Analytics, which is a analytics company in the wound care space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as central to the value of prediction. And I would argue that central to the value of prediction is empowerment. Oh, great. That's even better. Perfect. Is empowerment, okay? And the idea is that if we can't empower physicians, surgeons, patients to make use of a tool or a prediction algorithm to make them better at what they do, then whether or not we're able to do the prediction is in itself not that important. And this weekend, I happened to be watching Netflix, and so I saw I Am Mother, and I thought that it was a wonderful example of the two sides of this idea, okay? So the first, for those that have seen the movie, does this thing work? Okay. So in I Am Mother, there is a scene where a child who has never done surgery before gets to use image augmentation and is assisted in actually performing surgery. Here you can see that she actually has a visor that's allowing her to find a bullet inside of another human being. So this is where prediction is actually empowering somebody who didn't have a set of skills and augments their capabilities to be able to do something that they couldn't previously do. The other side of that is this. Okay, so this is the other side, where a robot that is controlled for an AI predicts that a human being is actually a bad influence and therefore decides that they need to die. So these are ways in which you can both empower and not empower human beings through the use of prediction tools and machine learning. But this speaks to two things that I wanted to talk about today. The first is that it talks to the importance of AI in surgery. So in a recent analysis by Accenture, the use of prediction and the use of artificial intelligence has the largest potential to increase value in the field of surgery, because we as surgeons actually do not use any of these tools to improve our capabilities. It is a rare thing to see the use of machine learning or predictive analytics in this space. The other thing that I think it talks to is the fact that central to the idea of empowerment is where in the workflow these tools are actually leveraged. So when I think about surgical tools, I think about how there's planning, there's a consent process, there's the whole process throughout the hospitalization. And what we want to do is we want to actually put those tools in the hands of surgeons and clinicians in such a way so they can actually make use of them in ways that both empower them and the patient. And so as an example of this, one of the tools that we designed, I apologize, one of my slides just didn't come up. One of the tools that we designed was a method by which we could use temporal data for patients who have a chronic disease of inflammatory bowel disease, and look at how we could evaluate what their trajectories were, and using that data, we can actually, with relatively high reliability, actually predict the likelihood that those patients would move on to a surgical event within the next several months. And the more data we learned, we could find out that for patients who had more than 6 months of data, we were actually able to get AUCs of about 0.9 for predicting their likelihood of transitioning to surgery. So the idea here is that we have a tool where we can adequately predict whether a patient is likely to transition from a chronic medical condition to a surgical need, but the question becomes, how do we actually leverage that? And so one of the things that we've worked really hard on and we're thinking about a lot is acting to put this in the hands of clinicians at the time where they can make this decision more effectively. The question being, do you give this to the surgeon? Do you give this to the gastroenterologist? Who do you have use this knowledge so that you can actually create value for both the patient and the clinician? Because on one hand, you have a facilitation of the process, and on the other hand, you have a process situation where you're actually disempowering the clinician by actually bypassing the doctor and moving directly to a surgeon. So those are some of the thoughts that I have about this, and I'm excited to talk about some of the other projects that I've worked on in the past as well.
Thank you very much. Our next is Christine, who will also introduce herself. Well, I have to admit, she was once my student.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here today. So Christine Chen Silvers, I serve as the Chief Medical Officer of a digital health company called Health Reveal, which is in the clinical decision support space. And Zach's question, is there value in prediction? He asked us within 6 minutes to share some thoughts. So here are some of my thoughts on this topic. First of all, which you've heard a little bit about this same theme earlier today, but what can we do about these predictions in terms of thinking, is there value? And to illustrate the importance of this question, this is an image from an article that was presented by some researchers last month at the International Conference on Nuclear Cardiology, where they took patients with chest pain and their imaging studies and took 85 inputs and created a predictive model to estimate whether or not these patients would be at risk for heart attack or death from any cause in the 6 years following. So as far as models go, which I've represented with this black box, It was pretty good with an area under the receiver operating characteristic curve of 0.82, which means where 1 is perfect and 0.5 is no better than a coin toss. This was pretty good. But if you're the doctor or if you're the patient, what would you do with this kind of output or this kind of prediction? And maybe we back up for a moment and think first, when we create predictive models, have we set them up to be created in a way that's even meaningful? So some of the things that we need to keep in mind are we thinking about all of the factors that may be relevant when we are trying to create a predictive model? And are we adequately representing those factors and the variance in those different factors in both the group with and without the desired outcomes? So what this makes me think of, a great example is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a mouthful, but that's the disease in the press, which is best known for young athletes dropping dead. And Zach's group, a few years ago in the New England Journal, reported the problem that the previous researchers had mistakenly linked benign genetic variants found in those of African descent with this deadly disease. And probably wouldn't have happened had they included some individuals with African descent in the group without disease, as opposed to just in the group with disease. And we heard earlier from the first panel about bias as well, so this is really that topic. Another question that we have to ask ourselves when creating predictive models is, are we thinking about all of the outcomes that may be relevant? And if we think to the diabetes space, all of the drugs that are being created for better control of blood sugar, and if we were trying to create predictive models, say 15 years ago or so, and if we were kind of narrow-mindedly thinking about outcomes of good or bad blood sugar control, then we probably would not have realized that some of these drugs are really quite impressive at decreasing cardiovascular risk or even slowing down the worsening of kidney function. So we really have to be thoughtful when we set up these algorithms to try to create predictive models. On the other hand, though, we can't just arbitrarily create models with every single outcome or hypothesis that we can imagine because of the statistical nature of machine learning, that if we do too many experiments that aren't grounded in any sort of reasonability, then we're going to find spurious results. For every 20, on average, hypotheses that we examine, one of them is going to look significant at the 95% confidence level. And I sort of love this comic strip that tests different colors of jelly beans and whether it's linked to acne or not. And in 19 of the little panels, they say, nope, we found no link between blue jelly beans, between red jelly beans and acne, between brown jelly beans and acne, and so forth. But in one of them, it's like, whoa, we found that green jelly beans are linked to acne at the 95% confidence level. So what we really just need to remember, and Jonathan was talking about this earlier in the first panel, is that machine learning can help us really find strong correlations in our healthcare data, but we need to remember that correlation doesn't mean the same as causation. And so if our real goal is for prediction to help us take care of patients and improve patient outcomes, we need to create predictive models that are, first of all, explainable, not just black boxes, and then we need to take those explainable results and vet them in prospective randomized controlled trials, where the results that still stand up there can then inform our evidence-based guidelines that we can then use to take care of patients and improve their outcomes. Thanks.
And next, I'll invite Arn up to come introduce himself and give us his 5 cents.
Hi, my name is Arnab Chatterjee. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here today. So I work for a company called Metadata, which I think if you sit in the clinical trials world, it is probably synonymous with platform, and we serve about 1,200 companies around the world for building a platform. About 50% of the companies worldwide that run a digital clinical trial go through our company. We are now a French company after last week's acquisition to Dassault, so we'll see where maybe we're a Cornai or something, in the future. And Acorn is a data science layer that sits on top of all of the assets that we work with, and I oversee product in that capacity. If I kind of think through just what we do right now, just one word on kind of where we sit and how we think about prediction. So we kind of work through it through a foundation layer of clinical trials data, and we have the largest repository of standardized and curated clinical trial data in the world. But then we're moving into new spaces like real-world data and sensors and genomics, and this is where I'll get into my prediction talk, and then Acorn sits on top of all that. So what I want to talk about today is, this notion of spending 4 minutes or 5 minutes talking about value and prediction. I think the short answer is obviously yes. The lens that I want to take to it is value for whom, and where is it actually coming from, and what is it serving? I think the angle we've taken so far throughout the conference is around a clinical framework, and is it enhancing or improving clinical decision making? The angle I actually want to take today is looking at the other side, and maybe it's the demonized companies that we're referring to throughout the morning, but I've spent a long time working with pharmaceutical companies, biotechs, and the big 3 or big 4 tech companies out west. And how do they think about value when it comes to prediction? Zach also asked us to think about human-driven versus data-driven guidelines, and where does, we had a question about human in the loop, but where does the human in the loop actually fit in when it comes to this stuff? So just to level set real quick, prediction in medicine has been happening since the inception of claims data and even before that, right? We've spent most of our lives trying to come up with better 30-day readmission models. We spent a long time trying to figure this out through risk scores and stratification, and this is not a new concept. So when we're calling this value, it means what needle are we actually shifting, which is why I want to look at it from the lens of the tech and the biotech world. If you look at what's happening now, prediction is ubiquitous. There are cases with, the imaging world where 90% of our health data is created. And we have things like, the diabetic retinopathy work that Google's doing. We have a lot of work that's happening in predicting colon cancer through better colonoscopies. There's tons of that stuff happening. There's also work like, in diagnosis and treatment patterns and understanding that work, like the Emory Sepsis Project. And even our friends in social media, we've talked about Facebook a little bit today. There's a paper that came out today, actually, from Raina Merchant's group at Penn that found out that if they could mine a lot of Facebook groups, they could do some causation correlation studies around words that are associated with certain diseases. So if you see a post that has the word pray or God in it, you're 15 times more likely to get diabetes, according to that paper. So I'm just going to leave that one there. Alternatively, in the social media world, just to talk about one study that I find very promising for prediction is actually around Vanderbilt, where they spent the last number of years looking at 5,000 cases of suicide and were able to come up with a 92% accuracy model for predicting a suicidal event within 1 week. And that, to me, is a compelling vision in terms of how we look at it, like a positive way of thinking about value here. But what I'd like to do now is kind of shift the focus here and talk about, what do we think about is the unicorn? And I think as everything, it's the data dummy, right? It kind of comes down to what is this generalizable way of thinking about all the things that we're trying to aim for? And if you talk to any epidemiologist, they'll tell you there is no good data source. And I think that's just a theme that we hear over and over and over again. But as we start to break these characteristics down of what's good data and why we need that to sort of kind of prove that prediction is actually helpful and useful, I think this notion of this holy grail of this perfect data set is something everyone aspires for, and we're building biobanks linked to clinical data, to omics and other sources to come up with a robust population. It's getting harder and harder and a little bit more micro and micro as we start to create these little patient silos. I think the reality is that if you start to break down the world, people will say clinical trial data is the source of truth. Other people say real-world data is more representative of what's happening in the patient population world, so which one do you choose? Maybe it's both, maybe it's neither. I think if you look at future-proofing models for prediction, it's actually really hard. I think the Google Flu project was a good example of one where you can't take a 1-year time series analysis to predict what's going to happen. I think also if you look at the way that standards of care are changing in oncology, you can't say that a certain mutation is going to be where a drug should be developed, and that's the prediction model for that patient population a year from now. So how do you develop something that's going to satisfy what takes place 5 years from now, and what's the prediction model for that? Most of my work serving pharmacos has been around building algorithms, and the first question they ask is, well, can we deploy this thing that we created in this healthcare system and put it into another healthcare system? And the answer is generally probably not. There are barriers to patient populations, there are EHR barriers, there are infrastructure barriers, and the whole acceptability of the physician community to actually implement this into practice. And the last thing is we all know problems of overfitting and how do we think about model validation. So I want to take two examples, one of what I think has worked and one what I think could have worked better. So this is work that we did serving a pharmaco that is doing some really interesting work in a rare non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And what we found was the ideal oncology data set. It was 10 years longitudinal. It had linked clinical claims, unstructured, structured data that was nicely standardized. This type of cancer is an indolent disease, so you need to have that 10-year window in order to come up with the right prediction models. And what we wanted to do was figure out, for this company who had a very clinically efficacious therapy, could we find out how patients transitioned into second or third line of therapy? And the model ended up unveiling a few different things that were good prognostic markers for how we would find out, based on a certain lab marker, based on, maintenance therapy, the positive and negative correlations behind whether patients advanced into certain lines. I started this conversation talking about applicability, and the takeaway is that the way this was used, the model came up with 5 factors, and it had an EMR model that was 2 times more likely to predict which patients would move, was used by the medical affairs group within a pharmaco. So what they would then do is identify which physicians would be most likely to be, the phenotype of that person who's likely to transition into therapy, and then how would you then inform that conversation based on the development of this model, so they understand, what therapy decisions they need to make. And I think when we talk about applicability, this is like the incremental inchworm moves that pharmacos are making right now. And I haven't talked about other aspects of AI and drug development and other things pharmacos are doing, but this is sort of the example of like a data science exercise that is kind of happening right now in front of us, and one that I think worked really well. On the slightly different side, and I'm going to even make fun of my own paper here, but this is some work that we did with an informatics group and on behalf of a big pharmaco, where it's a standard phenotyping exercise. And I think what we're trying to do is realize that unstructured data and clinical notes have an incredible amount of value. Can we start to create phenotypes for difficult to characterize diseases? And in this case, this was for peripheral arterial disease, where we wanted to, claims data only identifies this right 13% of the time. So how do we find patients who are at greater likelihood for PAD? And then can we start to pinpoint what are the characteristics of those patients? So we mined the unstructured notes. We found there were 5 or 6 terms that were associated with the physician diagnosis of that condition, things like limb ischemia, and certain other words. And we did a whole mining of the ontology. We had it validated by cardiologists. The specificity was fantastic. The AUC was awesome. What ended up not being good here was our inability to scale this anywhere else. We could only do it within a certain healthcare system within the Midwest. When we tried to move this algorithm into other populations, we found that it was not representative. So this is what I mean when in terms of like prediction value and scalability. When we're doing it on the other side for companies like the tech companies who are trying to scale their really effective but maybe limited algorithms, what do we end up doing? So I'd like to kind of put that on the table and open it up for conversation.
Our next presenter is, again, someone who will introduce themselves. Shez, please. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Zach, for the invitation. My name is Shez Partovi. I lead up healthcare, life science, and genomics worldwide for Amazon Web Services. I'm a physician by training, practiced for about 10 years, did a number of health IT startups, and before joining Amazon was the chief digital officer for Dignity Health, which was at the time the 4th largest health system in the country. I was responsible for 20,000 physicians and our patient and consumer strategy. I have one slide. Amazon is good at scale. And so the examples I want to give you for AI, ML, and prediction all go to essentially talking about what you can do at scale, at massive scale, of bringing the value of prediction and forecasting to healthcare and life sciences. So let's start with early research work. What are the problems that we want to solve when we're trying to identify what molecule, what drug is going to work for what cancer? Well, have you ever wondered how long it takes and how many years it takes to go through all the candidates, a particular molecular candidate for a cancer? It takes 5, 7 years of research work to identify and narrow down what's called essentially hit rate optimization. So what we do with them, we did this with our partner Numerate, is take in 280 million molecular data around the chemistry of it, the molecules, the way they're absorbed, the way they're distributed in the body, the way they're eliminated. Take protein structure data from the cell surface of the cancer of interest, take DNA, RNA data, take first-party data from the pharma companies about their prior research work, take open data that's available from different nations, and go and apply 10 CPU centuries of compute power to all that data in the data lake to predict of the 280 million molecules, which ones are the ones that are likely going to work for a particular cancer, and went down from 280 million down to 69. Applied 1 year of basically 1,000 CPU years was applied in 1 year. That same effort would have taken 7-10 years to sift through 280 million candidates to find the 69 that would work in a particular cancer. And so when we talk about precision medicine, we must not forget precision therapeutics. We always talk about precision diagnosis, but without the precise therapy, your precise diagnosis is just that, precise diagnosis. So this sort of massive scale prediction helps change the entire funnel of identifying therapies for those n=1 diseases. Because unless we can do this level of massive prediction, nobody's going to undertake trying to find therapies for the small, rare diseases. Now let's go forward and talk about clinical trials. If you've ever done a clinical trial, you know you have inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. And so the question for the pharma organizations is, what's N? How many subjects do I need? From where in the world should I recruit them? How much will the study cost me? Is it even feasible? Protocol feasibility is a big problem. And it takes a long time. In fact, usually by the time they hand the protocol, the inclusion exclusion criteria to brilliant folks to try to figure it out, when they come back and say, I think we got to figure it out, what happens? Oh, didn't we tell you we changed the protocol, inclusion exclusion criteria, go at it again. So here, working with Knowledgent, consumed all of PubMed, as per discussion earlier today. Again, first-party data from the pharma organizations, third-party data from the world, banks that are available, sort of the data banks, all the prior financial data that the pharma organizations have on their own. And it's an interactive web interface that you put your inclusion exclusion criteria in, and in real time it predicts N, your denominator. It predicts from where in the world you should recruit and how much the study is going to cost you. This is the level of scale that we need in order to sort of bring about precision therapeutics. So let's walk over to genomics. The first whole genome sequence, I think, took something like 14 years. Children's Hospital of Philadelphia on AWS did 1,000 whole genome sequencing in 2 hours and 20 minutes. So the scale of compute available to us is unbelievable. More sort of AI ML prediction happens on AWS than anywhere else. And so here's an example of a company, Grail, if you are familiar with that. Now we're entering the realm of precision diagnostics. Cancer cells, as they explode and die, release fragments of DNA and RNA into the bloodstream. And so this organization, this company, looks for those faint signals of the cancer cells that have died and released fragments, and sequences and combines that with EHR data to create has created a prediction model, and they're now going through trials to demonstrate their their ROC numbers. They actually can predict about 10 cancers, early detection. So this idea of looking for genomic fragments, you need to have the ability to sequence those rapidly, to be able to apply all the post-processing you need effectively and efficiently. For this to be at the bedside, it isn't a 14-year effort. It's not even a 2-hour effort, perhaps. It's sometimes you just, the way we expect a CBC result to come back. Well, maybe that'll take 2 hours. And so Grail is an example of an organization that uses genomics, genomic fragments, AWS to arrive at precision diagnosis or prediction of a probability of a cancer in a patient. And then finally, let's turn our attention to actually how to empower patients to use AI ML for their own benefit. I don't know how many of you have asthma or know anyone who has asthma. And so one of the organizations that we work with uses IoT, Internet of Things, puts a cap on the asthma inhaler. So there's a regular dose inhaler and there's a rescue dose inhaler. So what happens if we are able to, every time a kid presses the regular dose, get that signal to the cloud and get it into data lake? What could we do with that? Well, there are 3 lifts to this. The first lift is the easiest one you all know about, which is if you don't press the button, I can remind you. And adherence is an important part. It's the sort of what I call table stakes of connecting to digital therapeutics and understanding medications. Let's go to the second lift. We know that kids take rescue doses. Well, we know that kids don't end up in the emergency department overnight and immediately. They feel bad for a number of days. They take more and more rescue doses, day -5, day -4, day -3, and they end up in the ED. Well, we can now predict, because of the number of times they take the rescue doses, that they're going to end up in the ED. And call mom and dad and say, Junior needs to come in. Published article on this, reduction of ED visits by 82%, ED visits by 82%, hospitalization by 90-something%, and appropriately increase in urgent care, ambulatory visits by about 60%, in-office visits. That was the second lift. But now comes the AI/ML part, the third lift. And this is the last thing I'll share with you, which is, what if every time you take that rescue dose, you let me and I'll GPS your location? I check the particulate index in the air, I check the ozone index in the air, the pressure barometer, and temperature. And if you allow me, I'm going to check your Fitbit or your Apple Watch and see how active you are. And I'm going to build a personalized model just for you. And so in the app, when Junior wakes up in the morning, there's a personalized asthma forecast that says, today you might want to skip gym, because I'm predicting the conditions are right, that if you're physically active today, you're going to have an attack. That's taking AI/ML at scale, where it's a model for a human, for one person. It's not a model for a system or a model for right down. And so these are the opportunities when we talk about doing AI/ML at scale, whether it's whether it's precision therapeutics, precision diagnostics, or digital therapeutics. And thank you.
Thank you. So I think we got a very nice tour of the horizon from the operating room to the outpatient inhaler. And so, again, you're invited to ask questions. If not, I'll start by asking questions. But as we've seen, typically there's more questions than questioners than we have time, so I'd like to give the audience the opportunity. So why don't you start?
Hi, James Lindsay. I'm a bioinformatics engineer at Dana-Farber. So I'm going to maybe abuse the word value in this session. Yep. As a patient, I could definitely see, or like as a human, I can see value in predicting whether I'm going to get asthma before gym class. But and then you take in all my data to make that prediction. But like, what protections do we have that maybe 10 years from now, Amazon has a bad quarter and you decide to sell my data to Blue Cross Blue Shield, and now I can't afford insurance in the future. So like, what kind of protections are your companies kind of putting in place to make sure that the value we get today doesn't take away from the value in the future?
So I suppose that's a version of the do no evil question.
Well, since you said Amazon, I suppose I should start. And
Yeah, I think you should start.
Certainly let the...
I guess they says that after he ate the lunch that you made as
It's all
sponsors.
good. I think we shouldn't underestimate the value of predicting asthma. I think those who have it would think it's important. Most may not be aware that Amazon Web Services has a very specific perspective on data, and that the data belongs to the customer and the content, and we never open the payload. It's an important distinction because sometimes there's confusion based on things we hear in the market. AWS has a very specific perspective. We don't even, so that example that I gave you, one of our partners, Propeller, actually has that product they built on AWS. Amazon doesn't even look inside Propeller's data. And the question I think you're having is more directed towards Propeller in this case. And I know they have phenomenal privacy and security policies, but just for the sake of clarity, AWS does not own any customer data, does not look inside customer data, does not have an opinion on the customer data, and we simply ensure its privacy and security. So we actually don't own it. We couldn't give it away to anyone. That data that comes in and Propeller stores, we have no We don't touch it. It's not opened. And so some don't realize that AWS has a strict policy around that we do not own data, we do not look at data, we do not sell data. So that's a clarity. I'm glad you asked. I could clarify that.
But I think also in that question was something that reminded me of something that Arnab said, which is these programs are not future-proof. And I think among the things that the gentleman was alluding to was, what if the future is different? So I'm not asking you to speak necessarily for metadata, Arnab, but how do you think about the fact that, like all other knowledge, even if well done, it's transient? And let me just quickly say, so I can be the heavy, in medicine, we practice a lot of transient, out-of-date knowledge, way beyond its expiry date. So it's not like we're not doing this already, but ensconcing this knowledge in automation makes it a lot easier to point and say, hey, and appropriately, that is out-of-date knowledge. So how do you think about it?
Yeah, so it's increasingly getting blurred as we think about sort of the different intersections between tech companies, healthcare companies, insurance companies, life sciences companies. There's a lot of cross-pollination happening right now, and I think when these agreements are made, a lot of them, aren't necessarily future-proof, but I think that has to be embedded within how these structures and frameworks are built out in the future, especially these multi-year MSAs that companies are now taking where they're building out, drug targets that are 10 years from now, right? These are not insignificant types of agreements. I will say at Metadata, so I mentioned, we have a large clinical trial repository of data. It's about 17,000 trials. It's 5 million patients. It's not an insignificant amount of patient population. And the way we safeguard against it is we renew our policies with our sponsors, which is pharmacos and hospitals, other companies we work with, every 2 or 3 years. We have very clear and very, very transparent rules on how that data is being used, so we can't package this into a certain data set and sell it back to the market. That's not part of our policy, nor will we ever do that. I think there's important safeguards that you have to do right now in order to create some kind of safeguard for the future. And there's only so much tea leaf reading you can do right now. And to your question about whether the stock deteriorates, does that change my prognosis, or do I get worse as a patient? I don't think that's ever the nefarious intent of anybody we work with, or same with AWS or Google or any of the other companies. It's just one of those things that it cannot be an unintended consequence of these types of partnerships.
And Christine, in your company, you actually are working on with the fact that a lot of doctors actually don't do, unfortunately, state-of-the-art care, and maybe bringing these predictive diagnostic algorithms might improve care. So in the context of Health Reveal, perhaps, do you want to tell us how you think about that?
Yeah, we are really trying to look at it from the standpoint of augmenting physicians who can't be expected in the kind of environment where we have so many studies that are constantly being published and guidelines being written every year or every couple of years in every single chronic condition, that we can't expect our physicians to take in and keep up with all of that information, and in the span of 7 or 10 minutes that they have with patients, be able to know which guidelines apply and which therapies their patients are or are not on or are eligible. And bringing it back to the question that was posed, really the agreements that we have with our clients are for the benefit of their patients. And again, like Arnab was saying, we have it written in that we're not packaging, selling, or anything. It's really just using the data and aggregating it from multiple sources, whether it's administrative claims, electronic health records, and so forth, for the benefit of understanding individual patients so that we can make those individual specific recommendations.
Please identify yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Grace the Conqueror. This question is well, here we go. Let me just ask the question.
Uh-oh.
Hold yourself.
All right.
At times I've noticed in the history of medicine and healthcare, trauma has been ignored. And in relation to people of color, knowing the history, but seeing a lot of practitioners and people in general find safety in a best practice called ignoring. And silence is violence. And I would like to know, in what ways have you acknowledged or will you acknowledge trauma in people of color, and how can it be made applicable to using artificial intelligence in precision of medicine?
So that's a good question. And let me begin by answering it myself, and then any of the panelists are welcome to answer it. The fact is, you're absolutely right. And in a state, for example, Massachusetts, where we're mandated to report on domestic violence, and we do ask every patient in the ED, do you feel safe at home? I can tell you that we have used very straightforward, very simple artificial intelligence techniques. One of my current colleagues here at Harvard, Ben Rice, did a study that got published a long time ago now, 2009, in the British Medical Journal, looking at just the discharge summaries from emergency rooms in Massachusetts. And we're able to just look in a very, very trivial way, identify domestic abuse on average 2 years before the healthcare system is aware of it, and up to 5 years. And a significant portion of them, but it was not, there was equal representation, unfortunately, across all socioeconomic, but also across all ethnicities. The problem is, in a 30-minute visit, people are dealing with the problem they're seeing there in the emergency room, and they just say, do you feel safe at home? And then if no one says anything, they move on. But disclosing that you're not safe at home is a big deal. And so if we could actually say it with feeling and knowing that there's actually a real risk, that would change things. So we actually created the infrastructure and methods to do that. But have we implemented it? No. And that's not, I believe, a artificial intelligence question. It's a societal priorities question. And so in this instance, artificial intelligence can assist the doctor to better identify the sources of trauma of any ethnicity, conditional on training the algorithm right with the caveats we heard before. But the issue is, what does our healthcare system make a priority? And what do our medical leaders make a priority? Any other comments?
Maybe I'll add some thoughts. When it comes to training models, there are the sort of 3 V's people talk about that are important that help address the question that was raised. First V is variety. In order to eliminate some of the inherent bias, the variety of the type of data that you want should include all sorts of things. In this particular case, for example, would be ethnic diversity and racial diversity. Then there is volume. You need lots of it in order to train the model appropriately. So variety and volume, and then veracity, which is the accuracy of the data itself. And so I think, and this goes partly to the unicorn data question you posed, which is there a data set out there that trains their models perfectly? Data wrangling and finding the right data for training the model was also actually a question in the early session. It's an important part of avoiding inherent bias. And so it behooves us all as we go out building our models to ask ourselves, are we sticking to those 3 V's of variety, volume, and veracity? And so that's one thing. And if permitting, I'll address one other thing, which is we've been hearing really thoughtful discussions from health systems when it comes to the unintended consequences of applying machine learning and applying predictive and forecasting. The particular example is I was involved in a discussion, which is a really great, thoughtful discussion around forecasting no-shows. Forecasting no-shows for an ambulatory visit. There is a system that is forecasting. So who is likely to not show? Maybe single mothers, maybe people who are disenfranchised, that have social determinants of health that are not at their advantage. And so the question, what they were discussing in the room was, what do you do with the prediction of a likely no-show? Do you double book? Is it an airline model where I want all the seats filled? Well, if that person then does show that single mother, does she get half the time because you double booked? Is that the unintended consequence of forecasting? Or do you take them, to your point, take the approach of, we need to find out if we're forecasting this person is not going to show. What do we do to help them appear? Because is the importance for us the full schedule or avoiding gaps in care? And if it's avoiding gaps in care, do we get an Uber or Lyft ride for them? We got to figure this out. So I was listening to the discussion from this health system that was being very thoughtful about the fact that, yes, we can predict a no-show, but what does that really mean? That's the platform telling us no-show. What is the people and process that we need to put in place to assure that we have fairness? And so I am seeing those discussions, and I see that health systems are really trying to be thoughtful about this. It's really encouraging.
Just one other
Please.
thought with regards to this. So I think tying in actually with the previous question about future-proofing data, I think this is all related in that way as well, in that when you think about optimizing this process, there is the historical data that is used to generate the model, and then there's the ongoing process of updating models as more data comes in. And so an optimal system is one where you not only have a model that is initially established, but then you have ways for constant auditing and feedback that allows the model to continue to update itself. And so part of the way that I think you can address these issues that were mentioned is to think about when you have a model where you might not actually identify all the biases that exist in that model. As you continue to update that model, as you get feedback on how that model is actually working, then you can adjust it to actually take into account some of the issues that we're describing here. So I think that even though we don't always know necessarily and can't be sure that we've identified all the biases, as long as we are able to update and feedback the changes that are occurring into the model itself, then we're able to at least adjust for some of these things as time goes on.
This can be answered now or later, but most likely later. But my question for that would be, what do you do when your method of practice, the face of it changes, but the heart of it stays the same? In what ways are you moving in love and compassion to make sure that what is, it just is not? I see this happening all the time. We change the face just to be diverse, but the heart of the matter never changes. It's as artificial as what you're creating. I would love to talk to you face to face after if you cannot comply or reply right now.
Whoa. So first of all, I think that your point is on, and you're right. A lot of people will just say diversity, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, I think some of the players in this room are genuinely trying to address the problem, but it's not easy. And part of it is rooted, for example, in poverty. And so, for example, if you, I saw this amazing result where if you unleash a machine learning algorithm on data to predict heart attack risk, it'll come up with a very similar score to the Framingham risk score, but because it was included in the data set, it'll also include what tier of income you have. And the lower your income, the higher your risk of death from cardiovascular disease. And so that's real, but solving the poverty problem is a hard problem, and it's not one that we should ignore, but we should all just recognize and have the humility to recognize that AI is just a part of it. And the bigger part is, where does society invest its resources to actually use AI productively to identify where those resources go? So I think AIs can be abused, but it's a tool here. And I think your question speaks to societal priorities. Identify yourself.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Rebecca Burkholz, and I'm a postdoc at the Harvard Chen School of Public Health. And it's actually interesting how the discussion continued from when I started. I wanted to ask a question. It's actually perfect. So my question is related to causality, because actually all of you, somehow mentioned interventions. You actually don't want to only predict. You want to, change the system, you want to, you highlighted that correlation doesn't imply causation and so on. And I was wondering now, you know, what is the role of AI in that? What kind of role you see of AI in that? And also, you all are involved in the collection of data as well, or at least, you know, you make decisions about, you know, how data is collected. And I was wondering, you know, what kind of data would you like to collect, and maybe also in addition to, you know, the analysis of the data, you know, that that happens at the same time. Because usually, you know, when you want to make causal claims, you need some kind of intervention, and usually you also want to decide, you know, you want to update your questions that you specifically have and collect data to answer exactly that question. And that's not very specific to AI. I mean, this happens, as, you know, it doesn't matter if you have linear models or non-linear models or whatsoever, what kind of data analysis technique you use, right? But the question is more, you know, do you also want to couple the data analysis with the data collection?
All right, so Gabe, I'm going to put the pressure on you for starters. If you want, as you do, to revolutionize surgical practice, and as you correctly point out, there's so much to be done in surgery because, in fact, so little of it right now is data-driven. You guys are privileged in some ways. Unlike medicine, you can just do whatever you want in the OR, and so it goes. Okay.
I'm sure it's just that way, right?
There's a pretty clear outcome.
Yeah. The question is, if you could wave your wand, a somewhat realistic wand, what kind of data would you like to acquire before, during, after every surgery?
Yeah, so this is something that I think about a lot, actually, because a number of the issues that relate to my field have to do with what people are comfortable sharing and what they're uncomfortable sharing. And it has to do with the way in which people are able to then take a piece of information and isolate it out from a broader kind of context. And what do I mean by that is, if I had my druthers, then every case that was performed in the operating room would be filmed, and every patient who would go through the operating room would have a full set of biomarkers that would represent them before they got into the operating room, while they were getting surgery, and then in their post-op care, so that we would be able to not only understand what was actually happening during the surgery as it relates to specifically the surgeon, but also the characteristics, the physiological characteristics of the patient themselves. So what do we do now? We take the data we have and we try to form models, and we say, okay, well, we don't have perfect data. We have some proxies, and we use that to figure out, get a sense of some of these things. But fundamentally, if I had the ability to collect any data that I wanted, if I owned a hospital system and I could force every patient and every doctor to do whatever I wanted, then we would collect a tremendous amount of video data with regards to what's actually happening during the surgery. And then I'd have kind of stepwise, time-based biomarkers on every single one of my patients throughout the hospitalization.
Any other comments? Arno?
So I will say the great asterisk to that is, as the ubiquity and availability of data increases and everyone wants more and they want to hoard more, the clinical rigor has to increase, right? And that's what I find to be a huge challenge within a lot of companies, is that understanding even what to do with notes, even understanding what to do with omics level data and how to create clinical genomic associations. There's a lot of, you know, guesswork involved that I've seen with certain companies, and I think that is one of the perils of trying to be a hoarder or an aggregator of data. So I think everybody wants more, and I think there are certain companies that are uniquely positioned to be able to handle that, both from a, you know, processing perspective, but also from an expertise perspective. But then, you know, you kind of face the great hurdle of what do I even do with sensor data, and how does it even link back to a clinical outcome, and what kind of association am I making with it?
Can I say one tiny thing with regards to that? Because I love this question as I think about it more, is fundamentally what all of us would want would be the gold reference data that I could say for every question that I have, here is the gold absolute standard reference for that thing. And for most of the things that we collect, at best, because the rigor is poor and because the data that we have is at best a proxy measure, we actually, for very few things, do we actually have data elements that we can say, this is the gold standard that we know is the objective truth that relates to a specific question that we have.
So I do want to add, Christine, please.
I was going to add that if we could have any data, it would be to know the truth of how the patient is really doing when all we have to work with are administrative claims that were created for billing and not for describing the patient's actual condition. And even electronic health records were really created to facilitate billing and make it easier to check boxes that, just copy the problem list, and patients who are no longer pregnant still have pregnancy on the acute problem list, or acute asthma exacerbation that was from 5 years ago, and so forth. So it would be systems to really know truth in a structured manner.
So I'll just share an observation, which is there is no doubt doctors today feel quite abused by health IT, and it's because if they want to get paid the way they've gotten accustomed to being paid, they have to get the bills out, and to maximize billing, the tool of the trade is the billing codes to get maximized income. And so there's a devil's bargain there. However, what I have seen is as follows. If, at least in the academic centers, if those doctors can see that those same data are available back to them to improve their care, because they actually do want to care for patients, they will actually improve the quality of their data. And so, for example, we did a study at the Brigham with the rheumatology clinic, and where they saw that they could actually improve their classification of these patients and the tracking of these patients, they actually improved the way they use their data. So I think we have a long way to go because of the current state of health IT, where doctors feel more abused than empowered by health IT. But nonetheless, I do think that if we can, using AI, actually help doctors practice more effective medicine, I think we'll see, at least for a subgroup of those doctors, improved quality of care. Adrian, please identify yourself.
Adrian Grapper, Patient Privacy Rights. Most of us in this room process patient data into medicine. But before AI, almost none of that medicine was a trade secret. A lot of the AI that we have now, in these early days, is not patented or copyrighted or taught freely in a medical school, but is a trade secret. Where should the responsibility for turning medicine into silos of trade secrets lie? Who should manage that?
All right, that's a question. Anybody want to take a shot at the answer?
I'll start. I think there are two parts to my thinking around that. One is that given the discussion we had earlier around how the training data can affect a model's effectiveness, this may be a case where actually model migration may actually be more detrimental than not. And so, for example, if we train, unless we have the 3 V's and our training model is somehow fitted to a population, sharing it with another part of the country, another part of the world, may actually yield suboptimal results. So there is an element of practicality of, notwithstanding trade secret, whether the model actually is transposable to another area. So that's point one. It's just a point of awareness. Now on the other side, which is realizing that it's important to share models. Actually, one of the things AWS has done is build a model marketplace where people can actually even freely share models with one another, or if they want to license it, they can. You're right that we need to surface these models to be shareable. So there is a mechanism for that we've created. And with the caveat that as you share it, realize, depending on the training set, it may not be applicable to where it lands. So those are sort of both pro and warning on those.
Good. Any other comments on this? I thought that was a good statement of pros and cons. Gabe, you look like you almost want to say something.
I mean, this is not a fully baked thought, so I put that forward as a caveat. But so as a clinician, I find that question to be very important because there is often the question as to what to do with the models that are developed. You know, do you try to build something that you can share freely, or is there the push, as there are with a number of hospitals and healthcare systems and institutions, that certain ideas can be commercialized and then turned into a product that can then be sold. The interesting question that I think about with regards to this is that in a world where all the models are freely available, then the organizations that continue to grow are the ones that are the platforms on which all of these models exist. And so what that does is that actually, in an indirect fashion, actually empowers Amazon and other large data managers over smaller organizations that otherwise would be able to build potentially a commercial product. And so although I am fully in favor of the idea of sharing data and sharing knowledge so that we can actually move medicine forward, I wonder about the reality of a situation where if we don't have a way to commercialize ideas, then it becomes very difficult to essentially compete in a world where the groups that actually manage the data are the ones that actually have all the opportunity.
So, Christine, this is a genuine question, not a rhetorical question. I know that Health Reveal applies guidelines, things that have been recommended by leading cardiologists, for example. Are those guidelines in the public domain, or do you have to license them?
They are absolutely in the public domain. The American Heart Association, American College of Cardiology, American Diabetes Association, and so forth publishes these guidelines, depends on which one, every year, every few years, and they are really meant as guides for best practices for physicians to be using. There's some studies out there that it shows it takes 17 years for new research to go from bench to bedside. And so we need to do something to help physicians know what's being published out there, and no fault of the physicians, it's just too much to keep up with. So that's absolutely public knowledge, shareable. Patients could look it up and try to read sort of the dense medical material, 183 pages for heart failure, 150 some for atrial fibrillation, and so forth. But,
Thank you. Shez, one last question for you. This is not, it's just, I'm curious. Given the fact that you're hosting all these different data sets from different commercial providers of clinical data, have you seen any appetite whatsoever to actually have a third party look at the transferability of these machine learning algorithms from one data set to the other?
In addition to there is a marketplace that we've built where you can literally post. In fact, today you can go to the.
So that's posting the. It's not quite the same thing as running it and saying.
Oh, yeah, and so let me tell you what I think, and then tell me if I answered the question or not. So in the model marketplace, which is basically where you can post your model, and then you move that model to your own data, and you run that model on your data, and the organization that created the model doesn't see your data, doesn't have access to your data. You're simply taking that model and applying it. So it literally it's like a bulletin board. You post your model, I go there, I take it down, and I run it on my data. And if you posted it, you don't get to see my data, you don't get to see my results. It's completely private. So there's a way to share models, and then but when you pull it down to use it, it's private. What we're seeing is actually organizations now trying to create consortia where they train together without sharing data. So where I have data, you have data, and I want to perfect the model, so I may train it on mine and train it on yours, and then I get the model back, but I haven't touched your data, and I haven't looked at your data, and I have no knowledge of your data, but rather the model has benefited from training. So we are seeing that as well. So there's a lot of movement in this.
So that's very interesting, because of course that's a big part of the way to something that I've been waiting for a long time, which is a consumer reports function. So you can imagine that, something that the FDA does not do. Please, and I owe you a response, I know.
Hi, my name is Mugda. I'm a medical student here. My question is about how some of these predictive models or generation of more data is regarded often by clinicians as with more
nervousness and hesitation than complete acceptance, because in medical school we spend a lot of time talking about how you shouldn't order tests that you don't know what to do with, or knowing too much without knowing what to do with it can be dangerous for the patient and the clinician in the encounter. And so my question is, have you experienced it in your interactions with clinicians versus people on the value creating business side, a difference in how people are looking at data and predictive models, and is there, if you could speak to that interface and how you kind of combat that clinician apprehension to some of these things?
Yeah, I can start. So yes, I'll say that with a few caveats. So I think the first thing is a little bit of model overload, which is kind of going back into my, finding what the perfect model is and what this unicorn looks like within data, and how do you then instantiate or build this into clinical practice, clinical guidelines, and to your point about 17 years going from guideline into practice, it takes a long time for this to get there. I will say that we have started building out models with academic institutions that have been implemented into clinical practice. It almost comes in like the form of a trial where a subset of physicians will make this as part of a clinical workflow. It might be built in as like a CDS or clinical decision support alert tool. This runs headfirst into alert overload and what Zach just referred to as sort of this gigantic IT burden that physicians now face. So the key question is, how do you take prediction models and build them in a seamless, non-invasive way into clinical practice so that it's empowering the physician and not burdening them? It's a really, really tricky balance, and I don't know what's the proper way to slot these in, whether it's through medical information, whether it's through some kind of training, whether it's part of the IT systems themselves, which have their own barriers and hurdles. But there is plenty of work going to this. I think going back to what I was saying earlier about scalability, can you take it from one system where you've demonstrated success or you've shown improvements in clinical outcomes for a patient population and then put that model into practice elsewhere? So I think that's sort of the next kind of evolution of what we're seeing.
Chris?
Our standpoint is that what we're finding is that clinicians are a lot more comfortable if you can explain where you're coming from. So not a black box of your patient's at risk for, heart attack, try to figure it out, but rather your patient is at risk for heart attack because of the diabetes that is poorly controlled and not being on the drugs that are recommended by the American Diabetes Association. These are the specific elements in the medical record and claims data and the lab values and the drug claims to support where we're coming from. We suggest you might consider this medication to decrease the risk. And then, having that real visibility into where we're coming from and giving the physicians a chance to give feedback as to whether they agree with the recommendation or don't agree with the recommendation, and if they don't, why, and using that information to continually improve the system to make recommendations that are accepted.
All right. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is T. I'm a physician. So one of the problems in healthcare is not about the prediction or data or accuracy. It's mostly about the compliance of the patient and also the ignorance of the physician. So, even though if you could develop the technology that could predict very accurately, do you expect how much patients and physicians will follow? If you had right now there are a lot of guidelines, do you have any data that how much physician, the percentage will follow the guidelines? So, otherwise, no matter how much you spend the money and there's less benefit.
So I think the question is a reasonable one, which is, thank you for it, which is, if we build it, will they obey? And I think that you've heard one part of the question, which is, one part of the answer, which is, because of overload, people will ignore the alarms just so they ignore the alarms in the ICU. They go beep all the time. At the same time, I do remember an early study done, I think with Jonathan Teich at the Brigham, where they were doing one of the early homegrown order entry systems. And turns out there's a drug that's an antiemetic drug against nausea that it's used often for patients with cancer who are feeling nauseous, ondansetron, but it's also very expensive. And turns out the dose is perfectly adequate, I think, on every 8-hour dosing. But there was a lot of back and forth in the Pharmaceutical and Therapeutics Committee about what was the right dose. And they came up with the right dose, but they were worried that they would get a lot of pushback from the practitioners of the hundreds of doctors throughout the Brigham who were using the system. But what they found out is when the system went live, 99% of doctors just used the default dose and frequency that was on the order entry system. So on the one hand, it's very hard to make physicians do things, especially when you're imposing on their attention that's already been diffused out almost impossibly across that 10-minute visit. On the other hand, if things are done kind of by default, which on the one hand we don't want to happen because we want physicians in the loop, but on the other hand, increasingly that's the way it might happen. It's actually not that hard to get that decision-making made. Any other comments in that respect?
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point, and one that I was referring to earlier, which is that how we think about where we present the data, I think, is central to the effectiveness of these methods. When I look at what works best is a system where you use existing methods to actually improve the care processes of clinicians. So an example is you try to stay out of the way until you need to get in the way, as opposed to what traditionally has been, clinical decision support tools, where you get a pop-up every single time that you try to put it in order, and you think differently about that, what these algorithms can do. So as an example, in my company, we created a tool where we leveraged what was already happening in the wound care space, where wound care nurses were already taking pictures of wounds. The only thing that we did differently is we took those images and used them to then automatically track what was happening to that patient's wound over time, and then provide feedback for whether it be the clinician or the nurse who's doing that care, either at the point of care or later on. So the difference was if you can, you try to stay out of the way of the clinician as much as you can, and only provide that assistance in a way that actually improves and their ability to take care of patients over time. And I think that if you do that, as opposed to just building kind of these blanket tools, then I think you have an opportunity to use these personalized, advanced techniques to really build value in a way that clinicians really appreciate.
Yeah, if I could.
You will have the last word.
Oh, okay, that's heavy then.
Sorry.
There's one aspect that we've not talked about much today, and you referenced to it, which is the workflow improvement that AI can bring. So we talk about physician and caregiver, care team burnout. I was visiting with a EHR company in the UK, which is using Amazon technology of voice recognition, transcription, and AI to just listen to the conversation, not record it. Listen to the conversation between patient and physician, and dynamically change the EHR screen and the order sets based on the conversation to make it easy for the physician to do the right thing. It's not predicting disease, it's not trying to make a diagnosis, but rather simply saying, just keep talking to the patient. I'll listen in the room and dynamically create an EHR interface for you that makes it easy for you to do your work when you're ready. And so there is a lot of atomic intelligence that we can embed that's going to change care team workflow that can help reduce burnout, that has very little to do with diagnosing disease, but rather just simply make our lives easier. That's, I think, an easy place to start.
I completely agree that predicting what the physician will need or the care provider will need in the next step is hugely important. Unfortunately, as I and others have warned when we invested billions of dollars in our current health IT system, there's now a bit of a barrier to implementing these technologies, but that's a story for another day. So at this point, I'd like to thank our panel for really holding up gracefully under stress. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I would thank you very much. Keep on going. Keep on going. I am now about to introduce. Yes. To those who are tracking us online, we are now taking not all our speakers in the afternoon wanted to be online, so unfortunately for those of you who are tracking us by video feed, we're going to have to take it offline now. We will come back online approximately, 2:45, so I apologize for that.